welcome and thank you all for joining us for our panel discussion, Name, Image, and Likeness, the Present, and also the Future. I'm Dr. Melvin Lewis, Associate Professor for Human Nutrition and Hospitality Management, also known as Sport Hospitality. What I'd like to do is start with our panel, let them give a brief bio intro of themselves, and then we'll go ahead and kick off the panel today. So I'd like to start with Ms. Summer, if I could.
Excellent. Thank you. Glad to be here today with everybody. Thank you, Dr. Lewis, Dr. Billings, and really impressed with your campus and everything here. We had a great tour today. My name's Julie Summer. I am an attorney in Seattle, Washington, and I practice law. It's my main day job, and I'm also on the board of directors for a think tank, a national think tank called the Drake Group, which works in collegiate sport reform. We have primarily focused on academic integrity, but also there's so many issues that's been happening in collegiate sport reform that's hard for us to not comment and take positions and do a lot of writing and press releases and research on all the other issues that are happening. So we've done a lot of athletes' rights, including name, image, likeness. We're very pro name, image, likeness. But we also take other more nuanced positions. And I've been serving on that for almost 2 years. And I don't want to give too much more. So it's great to be here.
Thanks for having me, everyone. My name is Matt Brown. I am a sports writer. I was the editor, one of the college football editors for SB Nation for several years. And then right when the pandemic happened, I was one of the sports writers in the previous study that was laid off and had to figure out their own new path. So I've been running a newsletter called Extra Points for the last almost 2 years, which covers off-the-field stories that shape what we see on the field in college athletics. That includes stories about name, image, and likeness. It includes higher education, business, finance, and cultural stories that intersect with college athletics, as well as some administrative stories like conference realignment or the Department of Finances. I've been doing that for the last year and a half. I'm based out of Chicago.
Hey, my name is Kevin Mudd. I am a doctoral student here at Alabama. I defend my dissertation here in 6 days with Dr. Billings, Dr. Lewis, and Dr. Brown on the back, so slightly nervous about that, but outside of that, it's pretty good. Focused my dissertation on NIL and how the media impacts student spending, or really student athlete, and how you're going to get paid. Because ultimately, NIL just opens the door of the relationship between the student athlete and the fan, and how those two combine as getting paid. So that's what the study looked at. Outside of here, I'm an instructor pilot in the Air Force. If you were at the New Mexico State game, I was the guy that led that flyover. Interesting side note, but it's been an interesting career. I was able to work with the Crimson Tide Foundation here, so got to see inside the athletic department and understand it a little bit better, and it's helped bring a more rounded view to NIL and student athletes. But thank you.
Beautiful. Thank you all for those introductions. So Julie, I'd like to start off with you. You're a former student athlete, practicing attorney, and heavily involved with the Drake Group. So you're well versed in this area. When you look at name, image, likeness, how did we get here with state laws and the impact for student athletes?
Well, I left that part out. I was a college athlete, swam at the University of Texas, so thank you. It's a positive thing. I'm sure you all know it's NILs are the monetization of ability to, athletes can now engage in third-party agreements with endorsements, publicity. It can be self-employment. Positive step in the world of college athletics, where athletes are being treated like other students on campus. They can create a startup in their dorm room like anyone else. They wouldn't be able to do that before. True game changer. Expected to be a $1 billion annually industry within the next 2 years. And really how it started were, I'd say, over the past couple of decades, some really significant court cases. I'm sure you've probably heard of the Edward O'Bannon case, the Jeremy Bloom case, that really challenged the amateurism model in NCAA, preserved by Law 12, and also a unionizing effort. Over those couple decades, then California really made a very significant move in February of 2019, where they introduced the first NIL bill, and that was the Fair Pay to Play Act. And indeed, they ended up passing that bill in September of 2019. And in that intervening period, the NCAA did start to work, seeing the writing on the wall, we need to talk about these issues, and created a working group, a Division I council, and a federal and state legislative working group to start to work on responses to this proposed legislation. Other states, of course, had followed suit, had started introducing bills. This was 2019, 2020, slowed slightly by the pandemic and legislative sessions shutting down in 2020. Probably would have happened even more quickly.
Okay.
So a bevy of other states started introducing legislation. Florida State, the state of Florida, took the proverbial ball from California and said, we're going to make our date much earlier. So they really pushed it with the July 1st date of this year. California had initially made theirs 2023, signaling to the NCAA, we're going to give you some time to figure this out, but we're doing it.
Right.
And Florida and then the other SEC states said, you know what, we see what's happening here. And it quickly, became evident that this was also a new recruiting point within collegiate sports. So pushing the ball and moving forward with the effective dates. We are currently at 28 state laws. 21 became effective by this past October. And then the NCAA, in the meantime, while they had been working on their rules, in January of this year, they received a letter from the Antitrust Division of the Department of Justice cautioning them that any type of restrictions would run afoul of antitrust. So they tabled their recommendations that they had been working on. And then, of course, so much happening in the last couple of years, and we also had the significant Alston case, which was not an NIL case, but the court was very clear when they ruled in June that the NCAA cannot, you have to be very careful on any type of restrictions and running afoul of antitrust. So as a result, at the last minute, right before July 1st came and Florida and the other states went into effect, the NCAA announced their interim rules, which are basically 4 guidelines, and states have that law, they can follow the law, they can engage in NIL activity. States that don't can engage in NIL activity, follow the NCAA guideline, and look to their institutions for guidance and questions. What they don't allow is that the schools cannot pay NIL, no pay for play, and of course use them as inducements to either enroll, attract, or retain college athletes. So those are the restrictions we have. At this point, I was just looking at some of the current figures, and Open Doors is helpful with sharing a lot of their figures. So I looked up some of the most recent, there's, I'd say, hundreds of thousands that have engaged in NIL activity, college athletes. And there's been a significant increase in the last few months. So through October 3rd, through October, there's been a threefold increase in total NIL compensation since it went into effect in July. And the average comp per activity exceeded $1,000 as of now. And for Division I athletes, it's about $686 per month. Division II, $67 and some change. And Division III, over $35. So it's grown fairly quickly. It's expected to. Licensing is going to be already is a big thing and expected to grow much more. And of course, based on different activities. Social media, posting content is the biggest. Let's see here, I already gave the division figures. And of course, it varies by gender. The breakdown for men's sports, Division I is about 82.9%. Women's sports is at 17.1%. So that'll be interesting to see how that evolves.
Right.
And we hope it does.
Absolutely, that difference.
Yeah.
So it's a lot of moving parts, and a lot happened since this summer, like you mentioned. What type of educational initiatives are athletic departments using to help the student athletes, the coaches, to make sure they kind of stay on the rails? Because I read and I watch webinars, they talk about the wild, wild west, that we need to have some kind of guardrails in.
That's right. Without name checking too many companies and third parties out there, that there are third parties out there that engage just in the educational aspect of it, that schools are retaining. There's some large, some are small, some are dedicated to just education, others doing it all, you know, the NIL management, and a lot of different new players jumping into that space, that's for sure. And some schools are doing it themselves.
Okay.
So, you know, utilizing whatever expertise that they have available on their campus. Athletics, business schools, law students. So, yeah, I would say, you know, it varies by school.
That's a challenge.
Right.
With that variation.
Right.
Okay. So now let's make a pivot over to Kevin. Kevin, he mentioned that he was gonna be doing his dissertation here in 6 days, defending it. And your dissertation is titled The Effects of Media Exposure in College Football Upon Fans and Name, Image, and Likeness Merchandise Potentials, okay? Which is perfect timing with all the NIL developments. So good luck, by the way, with that. But tell us what you found from your study.
Yeah, so looked at college football because it's highest in viewership for all of collegiate sports, so it gives us really the highest numbers that you're gonna see in terms of potential fan spending. So what I took a look at was how does media affect fans? And the specific media that I looked at was indirect consumption. So watching the game on TV, or cable, or internet streaming, viewing it through sports blogs, through websites, and also just sort of the after effects of who's up for awards. And then the other big piece was who's playing in the CFP. Like tonight, here at 7 o'clock, they're gonna announce, here's the new rankings. How do those shows affect really the spender in NIL, which is the fans? So the study found that as media consumption increases, there's 3 main variables that increase in fans. The first being their identity with their respective team and player. So each of the respondents had 400 respondents from all over the US, made it so it was evenly broken down by Northeast, Southeast, Midwest, and West, so that every single school in demographics taken into account, not just the SEC, which has been pretty popular here as of late. But the identity that rose within fans showed that, hey, if I went up and asked you, hey, who's your favorite team? You're gonna be like, oh, it's Alabama, okay? How attached are you to Alabama? Some people, it's like, yeah, I go watch them on game day, and some people are like, I've got the underwear on right now. Like, they are just dedicated to their team and how much they identify with them, and it's a reflection of their self. The other thing that went up was their loyalty to their team. Are you gonna stick with your team when they're losing? Are you gonna stick with your team when they're winning? Are you a bandwagon fan? And it did produce that final piece, which is the behaviors, which goes into this loyalty of basking. So I'm sure everyone just, hey, when Alabama won the national championship last year, you saw the videos on the strip, everyone's got their jersey on. And I am basking in the glory of Alabama winning. How many people had their jersey on when they lost to Texas A&M? Some people still did, and that's basking in spite of reflected failure. And what this study showed is that fans, when they had more media, whether or not their team won or they lost, they basked in it. They were like, I don't care, my team's on TV, I'm a loyal fan, I love my team. All of those variables combined showed that fans spent more on individual players. So now what's spending and what's the breakdown? Because that's really the big thing. I think the most important thing to understand is this isn't professional leagues. So for an autograph, you were seeing about $40 average per fan. For a t-shirt, about $100, so a little bit more expensive than your average standard t-shirt. For a jersey that you could go buy down at the fur, $100, and then a game used jersey, about $200 that they were willing to spend. I understand that this had a little bit of variance. That was just the average amount of spending that you saw per fan, but there was an increase that showed, hey, the more identified fans are willing to spend more on their student athletes during the time that they're in school. But that's really the outcome of the study.
No, that's great because it helps talk about your wheelhouse, Matt, with media, for-profit organizations, non-profit organizations, the type of deals that have been done for student athletes this year. So when you look at that, what do you guys think about as the economic outlook for the student athletes? You know, looking at media exposure, brand, and all of those pieces.
Sure. I think in the near term, we're looking at probably 4 different types of name, image, or likeness deal that will impact most college athletes. When I say most college athletes, I really mean the entirety of Division I, from football to rowing to men's and women's soccer, the entire membership. So one of those groups right now I think is still in its relative infancy, which is name, image, and likeness deals through group licensing. There were some universities that were really reluctant to engage in this sort of thing. It's changing a lot over the last 2 months. I think at last count, well over 24 institutions have partnered with the Brandar Group to then allow you to go to the university bookstore. You can do this at my alma mater at Ohio State. You can do this, I think, at a couple other SEC institutions. I don't know if Alabama's one of them yet. You can go down to the university bookstore and buy a jersey with a player's name on it. And then the university gets a cut of that jersey sale, and then the player gets a cut of that jersey sale. I think, especially for my audience, and if you're somebody of a certain age, I'm guessing this might be true for many of you here as well, that when you hear group licensing, the product you care the most about is the NCAA video game. The college football video game, which hasn't been produced for several years because EA Sports needed a mechanism to actually pay the athletes. And without a group license, that didn't exist. It's going to exist. It's probably going to exist in the next 6 months. And then every football player will get those residuals. I do not anticipate group licensing to be a major revenue driver for most athletes, in part because there aren't a lot of product lines that are available for most athletes. We hope that it becomes easier to buy women's basketball jerseys or to buy soccer jerseys, but at most institutions, it's hard to find those, even at places where women's basketball or women's sports is a big deal. I've been to the bookstore at the University of Nebraska, and at places like Oregon, it's hard to get these things. So those supply lines have to be changed. That's one potential deal. Another potential deal that I think is still in its infancy, but is going to be available to every single athlete, will be name, image, and likeness deals regarding coaching and regarding taking advantage of their athletic expertise. Even if you're a backup softball player at like Stony Brook, or pick some random big sky school, and you're only playing a third of the games, and your media exposure is very small. Chances are you were the best softball player in your hometown or your home county, and you experienced postseason success. And especially if you're from a smaller area, that's a big deal. And you are, nationally speaking, an elite softball player. And so we haven't really seen this a ton right now, but there is a potential market for that backup softball player to go back to their hometown or go to high schools or middle schools or private lessons or in that community and teach softball. There's some reticence from schools, particularly within the Olympic sports, because a lot of coaches make a lot of money from that private coaching circuit. There's occasionally more than they might make from the university themselves. So you might have a swim coach saying, I don't want my swim team, my athletes to get into swim coaching. I make 80 grand doing that kind of thing. I don't want you coming into my turf. Those are things that are, but if you maybe are more willing to share it, then that becomes a recruiting advantage. So that's a market that I also think is still evolving. When I talk to athletes now and I explain this to them, many of them, I never even thought about that. I would have no idea who I would even call about giving volleyball lessons or about participating in a volleyball camp. And I think more entities will come up to help. The third thing, which I'll talk about just very briefly here, kind of aligns with what you're talking about. We're starting to see more schools set up collectives to make it easier for fans to donate directly to athletes and then have that kind of laundered through a business deal, so it still passes through the name, image, and likeness regulations. But the initial money isn't coming from the t-shirt store, it's coming from a random fan who wants to support the Crimson Tide or the Sanford Bulldogs or whoever. And that's really new, and I don't think we know enough about how much of that market is going to be above board or transfer from the recruiting black market, and how much of that is still going to kind of continue underneath. Like, I still believe we're still going to have bagmen. People are still going to send Bitcoin or send casino chips, or if you're Tennessee and you do this poorly, McDonald's bags to funnel money. Allegedly. I'm sure nobody at Tennessee would have done something like that. To funnel towards recruits. I anticipate that world's still going to exist. The last one is the one I think we're probably going to talk the most about. And that's the idea of an athlete doing a social media influencer deal, monetizing their Instagram, their Twitter, their TikTok. And that, I think, is where we've seen a lot of these deals on open doors. That's where there's the largest supporting market to support these deals. I mean, you can go on Mogul or Market Price. There's like 13 different marketplaces to set these deals up. What I'm seeing right now, though, is I still think this is a really inefficient market. And I think it's going to be an inefficient market for, I think, the foreseeable future for a couple of reasons. And when I say that, I mean, for one, if you are a college athlete right now, even at a place as well-resourced as Alabama, if you don't have professional representation, and maybe if you do, you have no idea how to charge. You don't, what is an Instagram post worth? The university is probably not telling you. If they're telling you at Alabama, they're definitely not telling you at the other 240 smaller Division I institutions. And so there's some guesswork there. If you're a brand that might benefit from working with a college athlete here, if you are, say, I don't know, a random bar here in Tuscaloosa, you're probably not used to advertising online. You've never had to calculate CPM before. You've probably never engaged in influencer marketing, so you don't know what your budget is. You don't know how to judge success, and you're not necessarily sure how to conduct those negotiations. And in fact, logging into Open Doors or Market Price or any of these other systems is not super user intuitive. So there's going to be a lot of brands, particularly I think restaurants and local retail, that are not in this marketplace at all because they have no idea how to get started. And then to kind of piggyback off of what Julie was saying earlier, for many schools, the schools aren't really sure what they can tell. All they want to do is make sure they don't get hauled into NCAA jail. And they're already overworked. Their compliance department might only be 1 or 2 people. So they might say, hey, I hear you want an NIL deal. Please don't do a deal with the gambling company. Please don't deal one with porn. Please don't deal one with anything that's going to get the NCAA. Please come here. Please don't embarrass me. Anything else, go with God. And so I think we're still waiting over the next couple of months for people to understand how to connect an athlete with a brand, how you should price it, how you should determine whether that campaign was successful, and how you can go about scaling it. And until that happens, we're going to see athletes, I think, really underprice their services. You're going to see some that are going to be dramatically overpaid, and then a lot of people that are still waiting to participate in this market because it still seems very confusing and they don't really know where to start.
That's awesome.
I'll add to that on the eligibility aspect of that. I was joking, Matt, earlier that I was thinking of some other funny acronyms for NIL. One of them I came up with was noticeable intervention lacking from the NCAA, because this is seriously the Wild West. The 4 guidelines, it's not sufficient, it's not sustainable. We'll get into proposed federal legislation, but it's really an unknown how the NCAA rules are working. No one's really talking about inducements or pay for play, and how the collectives and group licensing are playing out, and what is genuinely a individual NIL activity, and what is based on a collective, a team, and subsequently does that trigger something like a Title IX obligation. So they're really, it's doing the institutions a disservice, really, because they're flying blind too here. So we need more leadership there with that, and so that's another big reason why uniform law is required.
So let's talk about uniform law. What do you think is the future? Student athletes, but also high school student athletes as well. Any type of exposure you guys can give us on that?
Yeah, sure. I can start with that. We've seen this happen a little bit because some state laws right now explicitly say high school athletes cannot engage with this or risk their eligibility. And I know that the national governing body for high school athletics is completely terrified of this, and to the point where it was almost hyperbolic about the level of concern about how it's very important that athletes do not engage. Other states do. Candidly, I don't think that the high school name, image, and likeness marketplace is going to be anywhere near as large as the college one. Working with a college athlete carries with it some brand risk because 19 to 22-year-olds are not always the most reliable pitchmen necessarily. They might get into trouble. We've already seen this season. They also might not perform athletically anywhere what you're projecting them to be. And if that's risky, doing that with somebody that might not have even finished puberty is even more risky. So I think we're looking at a very small subset of high school athletes where there's going to be an actual demand. That being said, for some of those athletes, that demand could be very significant. And we've already seen this in Texas. It's a quarterback prospect named Quinn Ewers. This 5-star guy, has a mullet, gigantic Instagram channel, and had the opportunity to make 7 figures in endorsement opportunities in high school. This is supposed to be the best quarterback prospect since Vince Young. And a kabuka company of all places, like, I'll give you equity, here's $500,000, and here's autograph companies that want to be involved. And Texas state law says you can't do that, so the kid enrolls early at Ohio State, doesn't play this whole season, just so he can go collect the money. There's going to be a kid like him once a year, or maybe one or a couple of those, and states that care very deeply about high school football, like Texas, or very deeply about high school basketball, like Indiana, I imagine will amend their state laws to accommodate for that, but I don't anticipate that being anything close to a typical use case, whereas in Division I athletics, I think if anybody wants a deal, anybody should be able to go get a deal for $250. And if they want to work harder at it, could potentially get more than that.
Yeah, I agree. I think, more the sort of what might be considered de minimis deals, and that 250 threshold has been thrown out as sort of the de minimis deal. I think it was in the Uniform Law Commission's proposal, which is something that also was introduced this past July. I think it was July they introduced it. So there's something called the Uniform Law Commission. It's been in existence actually for hundreds of years. And they've created uniform proposed laws for states to choose to adopt. And they've been instrumental in consumer protection, in commercial code. It's what the states all use. And they actually have the Uniform Athlete Agent Act, which has been adopted by about 47 or 48 states. So they saw a need here in what was happening, of course, and that there was going to be uniformity, a need for uniformity. So they deliberated over about a year and a half, and those were some interesting meetings. We had high school people there, like saying, no, please sit down. So that was interesting to see, but that's happening. That's happening too. High school associations are definitely moving in that direction. And I'm sure it will continue. But they introduced a really great proposal in July, but the obvious obstacle there is that the states have to be in session. They all have to choose to adopt. They have to vote to adopt it. And then, of course, that only deals with just NAL rules, which are sorely needed, right, for implementation, oversight, clarity, and maybe a mechanism for adjudication, which is not something people are talking about, which is also a dire need. What's happening behind this when the deals go sour. Protecting the college athletes, with their deals with the, if it's group licensing, with the university, the three-way deal, and then also the third party. So disputes are going to arise, and I'm sure they already are rising. Even with the larger deals, there's going to need to be a good adjudication process. Tracking the agreements, the NCAA had announced a request for proposal during this whole last crazy couple of years for a third-party administrator, which actually a great group we recommended. And actually they had people really investing in that proposal and creating some great proposals, and then that was also tabled. So now we don't have a TPA, a third-party administrator for the agreements. We don't have any type of adjudication process. We have these very sparse roles, and there's very little guidance right now.
That's a challenge for everyone that's involved.
Yeah.
All right, but we're talking about these athletes, right? And the athletes, they form some type of camaraderie. So I want to talk about unionization. And this may be a stretch for you all to talk about, but from your lens, do you see where the National Labor Review Board may be involved to assist the student athletes with possible unionization?
Yeah. Go ahead.
No, I can't speak to that question legally nearly as well as some of my other colleagues can, but I can say, as somebody who's talked to a fair number of athletes and has also organized unions before, incidentally, I helped organize the union at Vox when I was there, that regardless of what the law actually allows, I would set expectations for prompt athlete unionization to be low, to be honest with you. And I think there's some element within my national media peers of maybe doing a little bit of wish casting about, I hope athletes sit out this event, or I hope that there's an immediate collective labor action now. And I understand that, because there's clearly some financial injustices. But I think one thing that we really saw leading up to the pandemic football season was one of the hard things about organizing any union is you need to get everybody in that bargaining unit to really be unified in purpose about what your goals that you're actually trying to accomplish. What we saw before the pandemic season is we saw groups in just about every athletic conference, with the Pac-12 United, and there was the Big Ten United, and even in the Conference USA about, we want to make sure that we get X number of protections. We want to make sure that our scholarships are going to be guaranteed. And in some places, we want ability to have revenue sharing, because we are about to now make significant personal, financial, and medical sacrifices to play this season for which we're not going to get any money. And we had all of these groups, and they were all rolled. But none of them really won anything. And in fact, we saw a couple of places within the Big Ten where not only did you immediately have the Big Ten United group, but then Ohio State, their players came out there and immediately kind of sided with management and said, actually, we have different views here. And that was because, listen, if you were in Ohio State that season, you thought you had a chance for the national championship. And even though you might feel some semblance of solidarity for your peers, are you going to give up a chance at a championship because the backup left tackle at Purdue has some labor questions? Maybe you should, but you can understand how maybe somebody would have felt differently. And that's one of the big challenges here, is that you can even have unionization. Like, I don't think it was an accident that Northwestern's vote failed. And it wasn't just because Pat Fitzgerald really put his thumb on that scale and brought in some other people from Northwestern's business community. It's that within even a very small bargaining unit and a football team here, outside of a handful of places like Alabama, you're going to have some people who can realistically expect a professional football career or professional sports career. And you're going to have some people who are going to be very fit dentists. And trying to get all of them to agree is a challenge. It's going to be a challenge when you are cycling through athletes every single year. So even if you have a Kane Coulter-like figure, a labor figure, that guy's graduating in 2 years. There's not going to be somebody who's been running the plant, the shift supervisor for the plant for 12 years to set up that kind of union. So I would be optimistic that legal changes are coming that might make these kind of votes or conversations more likely.
Okay.
But it's going to be ultimately, regardless of what people like me think, it's going to be up to the athletes to make that organization. And that's going to be a challenge. Whether it's the right thing or the wrong thing to do, it's not going to be a linear path, I think, to collective bargaining.
Yeah, it's going to be an interesting thing to observe as we move forward. Regarding the NLRB, they're already in it, right? We have the new general counsel, Ambrosio. She already issued a very strong opinion that we take on the new guidance that certain college athletes are employees. And now we have our first complaint filed as well. So they're going to have to respond to that. I think those tend to take a while, so I wouldn't, as the legal system tends to work, this won't happen overnight. So, but the National Labor Relations Board, their jurisdiction is only on private institutions. So, the USCs, the Notre Dames, all the other private institutions. But, there's been debate and discussion on that as an industry, it really could apply to all entities. So, University of Alabama or any other public institutions. And from an employment law perspective, that if private schools are unionizing, just from a practical standpoint, that public institutions are gonna also have to move in that direction, right? It's another competing factor. So, but yeah, this is I think part of the big reckoning happening, right? We certainly not seem to be stopping at NIL. There's this whole push in that direction, and where's the NCAA going to go? I read a great quote by the former Duke athletic director this week, who he said basically the NCAA must pick a direction, either focus on being an entertainment property or reestablish its roots in education, which is what we at the Drake Group advocate. We're very pro NIL and pro athletes' rights, but I believe that we're losing that student athlete part of it, even though there's a lot of weight to that word student athlete that we really don't advocate. But he went on to say that the experiential side, which is code for the student athlete experience, has become less served than the entertainment side. and I'm paraphrasing here, but he said it's really hard to serve both masters, education and entertainment. And because I think they are diametrically opposed, no one wants to say that because it's politically incorrect, but those are the things I think about after almost a half a century into this. So, a lot of people believe that that's not a healthy direction to go. We're heavily commercialized, unionizing, and monetization, extreme.
We're unpacking a lot here.
We are.
We are.
Yeah.
Everybody still with us? Okay. I have one more question for Julie before we open it up to the audience. And this is kind of bringing it all in, Julie. No pressure here for you, but you're an advocate for student athletes and also a former student athlete. What would be the ideal federal law policy relative to NIL? Gender equity, racial equality, athletic health care, you name it. What would you like to see for student athletes?
There's a few things on the wish list, I think.
Okay.
And this is where hopefully we take advantage of this, zeitgeist moment. Congress doesn't act very often in the collegiate sport world, just like the Supreme Court doesn't act very often. So it's fairly nuanced, but it goes way beyond. We know that there's going to be a critical need for NIL uniformity. So this is like the chance, right? This is our vehicle. So we've actually discussed legislation a good deal with people on the Hill in DC, and among just some good, solid, fair NIL regulations that are pro college athlete. We talked about issues. I'll tick down our list here.
Okay.
That college athletes are provided the highest standard of medical and mental health care, and that they themselves and their families do not have to bear the cost of that. For athletic injuries, short-term or long-term athletic-related injuries, those could be career-limiting as well, catastrophic, or the high-profile concussion cases that we hear about. Those are devastating.
Correct.
And that the national organization that owns all the national championships, whether that be the NCAA or whatever we come out with here, that the proceeds of that are used to provide a special assistance in catastrophic injury and long-term disability insurance, and other medically related expenses for college athletes, i.e. a medical trust. I think that's needed, and they can do that. There's going to be talk about the revenue. I don't know if you followed the hearings on Capitol Hill this past year, but those were interesting to watch in the Commerce Committee, with President Emmert being on the hot seat and discussing revenue and what what the NCAA could afford. And then also you can't ignore the fact that institutions are on a much different level. HBCUs don't have the same revenue as larger schools. So what's fair? What's fair for each to pay, right? Their share. Events that ensure the highest standards of safety and protection for athletes, and that institutions protect athletes from educational exploitation, and sex and race and other forms of discrimination and abuse. We've certainly had enough abuse scandals in college athletics, and it's time to have that reckoning too. So I think it would be a shame. It would be a huge missed opportunity for college athletics to just have a very slimmed down NIL bill and have them walk away at this point. That would be not good.
That's a nice wish list.
Yeah, well, actually, there's a couple other things. We talk about the
about that?
cost of athletic facilities and programs, that are appropriate. These are tax-exempt nonprofit educational institutions, so athletic spending needs to be addressed. And then also I'm sure Matt will have more to say about this, a very limited antitrust exemption, which can be controversial in certain crowds. So, but something to control those costs that the arms race, right? We've heard a lot of movement this week with different coaches and some pretty, eyebrow-raising salaries, right?
Right.
So, at the same time, you hear rumors of the NCAA perhaps lobbying for NIL caps, which, doesn't seem consistent with some of the salaries that are being paid out. So, not necessarily broad protection from lawsuits, but an antitrust exemption to control those costs. These are federally funded institutions. to the tune of $130 billion in federal funding and Pell Grants, and it's time that we recognize that and see that this is not your typical economic market.
No, my colleague and I, we were talking today about, the payouts for the coaches, some of that dead money, but also the contracts that these coaches are getting now. Brian Kelly, what happened last night. So you think about, and she's out in the audience now, so she may have a question, but again, it's about, the student athletes, give them an opportunity not to be capped so they can also have their earning potential as well, just like the coaches. So thank you. All right. So now I would like to open it up to the audience, give you all an opportunity to ask our A-star panel any questions that you may have. So I open up to the floor now. Yes, sir.
Yeah, thank y'all for joining us today. One of the things that I'm really interested in as a rhetorician is the language that is used in NIL, and Great Fall that I also think is associated with the drug group, KE Fever, or Lever, I think maybe I got that wrong.
No, Fever's her Twitter name.
Yeah.
Lever's her last name.
Okay, yeah. She is doing a lot of research about the language of student athlete versus like athletic laborer or athletic worker. Can you tell us a little bit about how that legally kind of frames the discussion of NIL or just athletes getting paid in general, and how it kind of works within the institution of the NCAA?
Sure. Katie's great. Do you want to take that?
Well, I can't speak exactly to the entire legal history of it. I'm aware of the origins of the term student athlete. And I can say that, one of the nice things about being laid off and then being in charge of your own media company is that you get to set your own style guide. So I don't have to say student athlete anymore, so I don't. In my publication and in my radio and in podcast appearances, I say college athlete. And there are, I think, other activists that might use other terms. I hesitate to use some of those in part because I generally don't hear other athletes themselves using that. I've talked to some athletes who still really feel very adamant to be called student athletes. And if I'm on the phone with somebody and they say that, great. I generally try to call somebody what they want to be called. But I haven't heard, I have yet to get pushback, if not student athlete, then college athlete, or just athlete, which I think is fair. I don't think it's an accident that you are starting to see more lawmakers and more third parties shy away from the term student athlete, given both its roots in labor exploitation and how the conversation itself is changing. It isn't I think meant to say that athletes don't also go to school. In fact, they do, and many of them take their studies very, very seriously. But it's an evolving term. I don't know if that may not directly answer your question, but that's what I've seen in my world.
I think the term really goes back to, in the Supreme Court in the Alston case really talked about it, is the term amateurism. That's really where the student athlete term is founded. And until that amateurism status is taken away, which is the root of NIL only being limited to their time, like one of the founding principles of the NCAA NIL is that the length of the deal can only be for the time that the student athlete is under NCAA play. So it can't go into their professional career. So they're limiting it to the scope of the student athlete, but you also sit back and you go, well, if you want to start talking about getting paid to play, you have to break that amateurism connotation for the student athlete. So it's not really the student athlete that's really the focal point, in my opinion. It's more the context of, is this an amateur sport or is it a professional sport? Because when you break those terms, that's where you really get into the legal aspect that you can talk about.
You next, sir.
I just kind of following up off of what Kevin said. I understand that, we've had this wild coaching carousel and all these coaches are now making, Brian Kelly's what, 95 mil across 10 years?
Right. Plus incentives, so he's going to cross 10.
Yeah, that's fine. But
money isn't real.
It's not. I understand that as a coach, that's their job. That is their singular thing that they are to do. They are to coach that team, win those games, achieve those expectations. But when you're a college athlete, that is not your loan obligation. So if you're looking at a standard student who's not an athlete, some of them are limited to work, what, 20 hours max? In order to be able to do what they need to do. So I think my question really is, should there be some sort of regulation? It's a little bit harder when you've got people like Olivia Dunn who have super high TikTok followers and she makes most of her money off of those endorsements, so it's not clocked by hourly rate. But should there be some sort of guidance and protection for those students so they're not, because 7 figures is incredible for a 19-year-old. You can easily get absorbed in that and neglect your actual academics as a whole. So should there be some sort of guidance and preservation and protection in terms of how many hours these students are actually working?
You know, that's a good question. It's funny because hypothetically, allegedly, there's supposed to be those protections right now, limiting the amount of time that an athlete can spend on athletics, in part so they can have time to go to school or be a part of fraternities or have this whole college experience. And I think most of us know that is a suggestion, and that there are workouts that are voluntary, but they're not voluntary, right? And it would be, I think if you were to impose similar kinds of regulations on this, it might be difficult to enforce. It's funny, we were talking about this earlier today. And one of the things that I as a reporter trying to get better about doing is not calling college athletes kids. Because to a 19 or 20, 21-year-old, you are a young adult. You are still developing. You might make poor decisions. You're not a child. I have a 7 and a 3-year-old. My 3-year-old's a kid. Like, my 3-year-old cannot make decisions for herself. But we trust college athletes to make their own decisions, potentially transformative decisions in a litany of other ways. And my impulse would not be to try and hold their hand about one more thing and let them decide. And quite frankly, if you can get $7 million right now, or 7 figures for something, I think it's okay if you neglect your schoolwork, because if you drop out and you're still making 7 figures, you can come back and finish your schoolwork. Like that may not be the biggest calamity in the world if you neglected your schoolwork to chase $250 thinking it was going to become $1 million. Then that might become a different thing. That would not be a priority, in my opinion. I think I would focus more on making sure that people aren't spending 55 hours a week on football, rather than not spending 55 hours a week on Instagram. Perhaps my colleagues might feel differently, but.
No, I agree. I think for the majority that your degree is going to be much more valuable than your Instagram account. So yeah, there's a balance to be struck there, right? And we're still early in this, which I think also we need guidance. We need institutions to be educating athletes on that part. That's how it's going to be done, and that they need to be supported in that, and not also on the other side of that, not be protections from financial exploitation as well.
One concern I have with NIL, I do believe athletes should be supported financially. I have an issue with that. My biggest reference is, of course, it's kind of cheesy, but the blind side with Michael Ward, the whole situation about how he came from poor living condition, didn't know his mom, that kind of deal. So my question is, what is your opinion about how the NIL can affect students who come from poor backgrounds, whether it's, if I get this NIL deal, then I can feed my daughter, or I'm supporting myself, my parents are around, I take this NIL deal at a big school, now I can kind of live alone. So what is your opinion about students who come from those kinds of backgrounds, and now you have this open world of a 19-year-old who came from essentially nothing to now 6-7 figures?
Yeah, it's a huge question. And one of the things that I'm troubled a little bit when I talk to institutions that have resources maybe a little bit below a place like in Alabama, is that there aren't other individuals that are able to, I think, to provide really practical applied advice. And in a perfect world, I think the athlete that you're describing here would need someone to talk to, ideally, that's not affiliated with the university, that really has their own, is accountable for them and their best interests at heart. And I think we both know that can be hard to find, particularly if suddenly a lot of money becomes an option. Then aunts and uncles kind of appear out of the woodwork, or agents that might not necessarily have your best interests in mind. I would be probably more concerned about financial deals independent of name, image, and likeness, which I think generally would be larger, or that might be more exclusive. The majority of the kind of deals that I'm seeing right now are typically not deals that I think close doors or take other things off the table or say you can only do X, Y, or Z. Like that might be the case with a sneaker endorsement or with signing long-term with an agent or a financial advisor. But these are things that I think if a university realizes that we have somebody that doesn't have some of that institutional support to help them navigate those kind of decisions, we have to help find somebody, and even if that person isn't part of our network. And that's a big issue. Even if name, image, and likeness goes away tomorrow, and if I knew the exact answer for it, I think my newsletter would be a little bit more expensive. But it's a major concern. I would share that.
We have time for one more question. Sorry, Ms. Bears fan.
Hi, so now that do you think higher profile agents are gonna start taking on athletes younger? And if they do, what do you think that pressure and expectation is gonna do to athletes if they fail or flop according to the expectation that the agent sets?
That's a very good question. And I was talking to a couple of agents about that earlier this week. And here's what I've seen so far. And by all means, please, anybody else. I don't think, outside of a few very high-profile college athletes, that most agents really want to be involved in the college world right now. There's a couple of reasons for that. One is just about anybody could be a college agent. And so I've actually done a couple of these deals. I even signed an Alabama athlete to one of these. And when I talk to some of these athletes that I find on these job boards or these marketplaces, and oh, this person's represented by an agent, and sometimes that person's an undergrad, and they're just representing their friend down the dorm. Then that's a different kind of conversation, rather than talking to Jerry Maguire. And what I've heard from other larger agencies is there's no money in this, because you can't sign a representation agreement that extends beyond the length of their amateur career. So there's no sense in dropping a bunch of money and a bunch of time representing somebody as a freshman who could then theoretically go to a different agency once they actually declare for the pros, and then you've been killing yourself to take 12% off a bunch of $300 deals. There's only a couple of agents that I think are going to really heavily jump into that space, jump through those hoops, sling the pizzas in hope of being able to sign somebody there long term. But what you're talking about there has enormous implications, I think, for mental health and for community support. And I think that's true for athletes even if they don't sign for representation. We saw that a little bit here this year. Somebody like Spencer Rattler, who came in as the presumptive #1 NFL draft pick, Heisman favorite, a lot of NIL and endorsement opportunities available, sets up his own design and logo and everything, and then he gets benched 5 games into the season or whatever it was. And I would imagine that would be an enormous amount of pressure. Whether that's with name, image, likeness or not, that's a lot of pressure. And it's incumbent upon that young man's family, his support structure, that coaching staff, that university, to find a way to build that athlete up so that kind of disappointment doesn't crush them. That's something as an industry, as a society, as we just saw, I think, with these earlier presentations, we're not so good at that yet. We're hoping to get better about it and prevent those kind of problems from happening.
I mean, we've also seen NIL deals change. We were talking about it earlier. Clemson's quarterback was the star of the Dr. Pepper commercial at the beginning of the season. You haven't seen him for the past 6 weeks. Because the second that Clemson wasn't going to compete for the CFP, Dr. Pepper completely changed their advertising. So the ramifications for that are absolutely 100% unknown. That you don't understand how that's going to affect both mentally and I would also say financially, because you don't know what type of deal was signed that says, hey, how many commercials that you star in is going to equal your pay.
And I'll add to that also big agents are already in it. We have CA, Wasserman's are already in. And it's interesting to hear the different anecdotes about brokering deals. I've talked to a lot of attorneys who believe, hey, if a lot of the state laws, actually most of them, require you to be licensed if you're acting as a lawyer in that state. If you're acting as an agent, you must be registered appropriately through the agency, the statute. So a lot of the lawyers I'm talking to are like, yeah, we believe you need to be registered as an agent, which means paying a fee, jumping through hoops to do these kind of deals, which is also, we're in this Wild West, so a lot of people are doing it. But again, there's no really oversight or intervention there or guidance from the national organization.
Yeah, I've yet to hear about the police busting anybody for illegally representing a lacrosse player. I doubt that's going to happen.
Well, thank you all. As you all see, we could stay here probably for another hour or so and continue this conversation. However, we need to go ahead and conclude. So thank you all for joining us today. Thank you to the panel. And have a great day.